Mr. Wynne. Thank you. So, David, just before the short adjournment, we were looking at the protocol. If I could just go back to that, please, and ask for it to be brought up on screen. It's 92739. And page 9, please. So we're just looking at paragraph 22, Sir David, to the role of the Civil Contingencies Group. And I think that you agreed that this protocol certainly foresaw at least that it would direct the response to the emergency, commit resources, and that it would have a strategic decision-making role as well. And that as part of its role, and we see that at the first sub-paragraph, that it would have the ability to direct and coordinate the efforts of the other government departments as well. And again, I think uncontroversial between us that that also could be done as part of the preparedness phase as well, correct? And if we just go on in this document, please, to paragraph 36, that's page 14. Again, if we look at paragraph 36, it foresees the linkage between NICMA, doesn't it, and Cobra. And specifically, it foresees that the Northern Ireland arrangements will feed directly into Cobra, correct?
Yes.
And again, just coming back to the fact that Cobra had been on foot since January 2020, who was then, who had that role in the absence of the NICMA arrangements having been stood up at that phase? Who was providing that government feed, as it were, into Cobra?
There had been a number of meetings of Cobra from late January onwards, and I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but in most of the Cobra meetings there would have been somebody from Northern Ireland. So on some occasions there would have been the First Minister and Deputy First Minister. On some occasions there would have been the Health Minister. There would usually have been somebody from the Civil Contingencies Planning Branch accompanying ministers. On some occasions, the Minister for Health would have been there. So on most of those occasions where Cobras took place and Northern Ireland had been invited, there would have been ministers, there would have been ministers present supported by officials as well.
All right, so I think the short answer to that is it would depend on who was going to Cobra. And if it was the Health Minister, you would expect him to feed in to Cobra, is that right?
Yes.
He would present the position on behalf of Northern Ireland, and then when the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister started to go, I don't think that was until March, you would then expect them to take that role on, is that right?
Yes, I think it's fair to say that the perception from ministers who attended Cobra during that period was that they were being advised what UK government was up to, but there wasn't much two-way transmission of information. I think some ministers have been quoted as saying they felt that their attendance at Cobra was often a tick box exercise.
All right, we'll come back to that if I may and address that in the context of some of the evidence and communications with the Cabinet Office. I just wanted to finish, if I may, in terms of the document on paragraph 41, and that sets out, doesn't it, the role of the lead government in NICMA. And again, I think it's right, it's set out in fairly simple terms, isn't it? That it has that role because it has expert knowledge of the cause of the emergency, which it can inform the response by formulating a prognosis. So allowing other emergency responders to understand the implications for their sectors. And then it also goes on to say that under NICMA, it's possible that there could be multiple lead departments as well. All right. I mean, in terms overall of this protocol, you're obviously very familiar with it. Do you agree that it was wholly inadequate for dealing with an emergency like a pandemic? Because it does only seem to foresee or apply to the sort of very short-term type of emergencies like floods and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's generally a fair comment. I think we would have recognised that there was a need to update the protocol. We had operated the civil contingencies arrangements for an extended period during 2018 and 2019 in anticipation of the risk of the UK leaving the EU without a deal with Europe, the sort of no-deal Brexit that was talked about. We had in 2019 commissioned a review of the arrangements. There was a report done by PwC.
So that's the futures, it's been referred to in this inquiry as the futures report.
Indeed, and there was a recognition in early January that there was a need, as I say, to update our arrangements. That didn't happen for a variety of factors. One was CCPB was short of resource, and I'm happy to talk about the context for that. But also the other factor was the emerging COVID pandemic, which really required us to activate the arrangements, and they were not subsequently updated until 2021. And in part, I helped to facilitate that by redirecting a senior civil servant from elsewhere in the Executive Office into CCPB in August 2020, Mr. Andy Cole, and he, over the next year, actually did update those arrangements, and there's a new protocol in place since, I think, August 21, and I think I understand, excuse me, that has been further updated in autumn 2023.
But just going back to the position as it stood in January 2020, that report had made 85 recommendations about civil contingency planning in Northern Ireland, none of which had been acted on by the time the pandemic had started to unfold. Is that right?
I'm not sure none of them had been acted upon, but certainly I would accept that there had been, at very best, very limited implementation of those recommendations.
Okay, and I think we will come to, if we don't come to it with you, but certainly we know that Mr. Stewart put forward a proposal on the 25th of January setting out the need for there to be a review of the arrangements. Is that right?
That's correct.
So notwithstanding there'd been that report making those recommendations, the recommendation in January was that there be a further review in order to determine how those arrangements could be improved or made more robust. Is that right? Yes.
That could make it sound as if Mr. Stewart was, in a sense, delaying the implementation of the PwC recommendations. But I think what he meant was that the review would make sure that the arrangements were updated, not necessarily implementing all of the 85 recommendations, because from memory, I don't think we agreed that all of them would be needed in the revised arrangements.
One of the things that he identified in his paper, and I'll touch on it now, but because you've raised it, was the need to think about the role of the executive within the civil contingency arrangements. And was that because it was recognised that it wasn't clear what its role and what the role of the executive committee was supposed to be in an emergency?
Yes, that's a fair comment. The emergencies that I had been involved in over the years tended to be weather events, storms, that sort of thing, floods. They tended to be short in duration. They tended to be events where it was quite clear who needed to do what, and ministerial involvement was not a significant issue. But clearly the pandemic was of a completely different order of magnitude. And our experience in dealing with the first wave, I think, did indicate that we needed to be much clearer about what the role of ministers would be in similar contingencies in the future.
All right, so I'm just going to stop there, and in terms of where we've reached about the arrangement that we've just looked at, the protocol, I think you agree with me, it's a document that applies to planning and response as well.
Yes.
as it sets out, that in the case of a threatened emergency, it provides that the TEO will facilitate multi-agency coordination through those arrangements. And it foresaw that the CCG would be the strategic body that would set the strategy for the response.
Yes.
But again, that could obviously be in advance of any emergency eventuating, yes?
Yes, and I think when you're talking about strategy here, there was probably two elements to that. The most important strategy, in my view, would have been, at that time, the strategy that was being prepared by the Department of Health to deal with the pandemic, to deal with the health impacts of the pandemic. What we were doing in the Executive Office under Mr. Stewart's lead was assessing the readiness of departments, and that's why the impact assessments had been commissioned and why the workshop on the 6th of February was convened. But I think it's worth recognising that as we moved on into March, into the second, third week of March, and it became increasingly clear just the magnitude of what we were having to deal with was going to be so much greater. I recognised that we needed additional resource just to deal with this, and for that reason, I had asked the Permanent Secretary of the Department of Justice if he could release one of his members of staff, Mr. Anthony Harbinson, to become the Chief of Staff for the hub. And that was in recognition that there was going to be just too much for Chris Stewart alone to deal with.
Yes.
And around about the same time, I also asked Dr. Andrew McCormick if he would release Ms. Karen Pearson, who was leading on our Brexit preparations, to also join the pandemic effort, because she and her team had particular expertise in risk assessment, in dealing with cumulative impact assessment, in looking at cross-sectoral resilience and planning and coordinating around that. Right. So I moved from the position where there was, in a sense, Mr. Stewart alone in this area to having 3 people by the end of the week beginning the 16th of March.
I just want to be clear about this, if I may, that when it comes to in terms of this idea that there needs to be a cross-departmental strategy, that you didn't consider that needed to be in place until the 18th of March?
No, sorry. Sorry if I've misled you. The preparatory work that was being done, led by Mr. Stewart and CCPB, was in a sense preparing that cross-departmental strategy built on the impact assessments that we had commissioned from departments. I think my point would be that we did not feel that we needed to formally activate CCGNI to do that that preparatory planning work.
All right. Well, I'm going to come to the planning in due course. One of the things that happened quite early on, so at this point in time, in January 2020, was that Sir Chris Whitty had sent an email, you might be familiar with it, on the 28th of January, where he set out essentially 2 scenarios that he foresaw could play out. So one of them was China would experience a widespread breakout but would nonetheless be able to control it. Or the other one, which was the worst case scenario, which was that there would be a breakout and China wouldn't be able to control it. Those were the binary options as he saw them at that point in time. Can I just ask you how much awareness there was on the part of the TEO at the end of January that effectively that's what the UK CMO was seeing as the 2 possible courses that the pandemic could take? Obviously, the uncontrolled outbreak being the reasonable worst case scenario.
I think there was general awareness. Obviously, we were relying in Northern Ireland on advice from the Department of Health We knew that the Chief Medical Officer, through his connections with his counterparts in Great Britain, was keeping abreast of what was going on. So, it would be through that sort of arrangement that we would have been being kept aware of what was happening. Now, I think in my evidence bundle, there's a note that I sent to the Permanent Secretary of the Department of Health on the 6th of February. I had been to a meeting in London of...
I'm going to stop. I'm going to come to that in a moment, because we're moving on then a bit, aren't we, to the 5th of February, and I do want to ask you about that. Before I do, though, I did just want to ask you about a communication that comes around that time, and if I could ask for this to be put on screen, please. It's INQ 00021 8470. Have you seen this? I think you probably have.
Yes, I'm familiar with the letter.
And I think if we go on, so we know that it's from the Director of Population Health. We see that at the very top left-hand corner of the Department of Health. And if we just to obviously setting out about sector resilience, but I think the importance of this letter is over the page. And yes. So that was certainly, it appears to be the advice that was being given by the Department of Health on the 6th of February. And we see there that the author is saying that she didn't consider it was necessary to activate NICMA arrangements at this time, unless and until the infection appears in Northern Ireland and impacts are experienced here. And then goes on to say that the CCPB have oversight of civil contingencies. And if we read down, says that it would be helpful to consider setting up a multi-agency meeting. Can I just ask, was that the basis upon which the TEO was working at that point in time? In other words, in accordance with this advice, that there wouldn't be any need, or that the civil contingency arrangements wouldn't need to be set up unless and until the virus had arrived in Northern Ireland and started to impact?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned earlier, this letter is significant, but as I mentioned earlier, we would have been in pretty much daily contact with our colleagues in the Department of Health, and we would have been reviewing things on a regular basis. And we were not being asked to activate the NICMA arrangements really until March. So, the letter is significant, but it needs to be seen in a context where there was active and ongoing engagement pretty much on a daily basis.
We've just seen from the protocol, obviously, you didn't need to wait for the Department of Health to ask for civil contingency arrangements to be stood up.
I think a point I want to make here is some people are maybe thinking that because we didn't activate the NICMA arrangements, nothing was going on. That is not the case. There was a lot of preparatory and planning work going on. It's quite a big step to activate CCG and establish the hub. It requires the redirection of a lot of resource. That resource at the time was in departments and in the executive office, and it was working on the preparatory stage of dealing with all of this. When we did actually activate the hub on the 18th of March and begin the daily CCG meetings, again, as I say, that was a significant step. It required quite a lot of effort to support that. I did concede earlier that it would probably have been prudent to have maybe done it a few days earlier, but I'm talking a few days, not a few weeks. And I think I would make the point as well that the Chief Medical Officer didn't ask us to activate NICMA until I think it was the end of the week beginning the 9th of March, so somewhere around the 14th, 15th of March.
So can you help me then, when all of this preparation was going on, in, say, January and February, who had oversight of all of the different plans that were going on in departments, and who was pulling those together to make sure that they were intersecting with each other?
Well, Mr. Stewart in CCPB would have been coordinating the work that was being commissioned from departments, but we would have been at that stage relying on departments, in a sense, preparing the plans that they needed. So, for example, as it became clear that we might be looking at a scenario where our schools would be closed, it was the Permanent Secretary in the Department of Education that was leading on that. And that was quite appropriate because the Permanent Secretary in the Department of Education is best placed to prepare the plans that deal with the consequences of schools being closed. Similarly, the Permanent Secretary in the Department for Infrastructure was best placed to deal with the plans that would be necessary to ensure that public transport continued, that our water and sewerage services continued to be delivered, and that our ports and airports continued to function. The Department for Communities had a clear responsibility in terms of looking after the interests of vulnerable people. What we were doing at the centre was, in a sense, coordinating that work, but we did not have the expertise, nor we are in a position to sort of second guess, if you like, how credible the plans being drawn up in departments were.
But I think the answer to my question, who has oversight over all of the plans and who understands how they intersect with each other, I think the answer to that then is no one had that role.
Well, Mr. Stewart is here tomorrow, but certainly I think he was probably the person who would most closely have had that role. And I would accept as the later chair of Civil Contingency Group, I had an overarching responsibility to make sure that the coordination of effort across all departments was being managed efficiently. And in a sense, that's what CCGNI was doing in conjunction with the hub.
But I think we've agreed that there wasn't a meeting of that until the 20th of February. That was the first meeting of the CCG. Was it the 12th? I thought it might have been the 18th. I stand to be corrected. My head is full of dates at the moment. 20th of February for an official one.
Yeah.
I think it's the 12th of March for a ministerial one.
Yes, sorry, that's right, 20th February. But the daily CCGs began on the 18th of March. And it was at that stage that we were getting the daily reports on the management of impacts across all departments and indeed local authorities, the blue light services, etc.
And can you just help me in terms of the planning that you've referred to that was going on whilst there were no civil contingency arrangements? When do you say that planning actually started in earnest in departments? Well,
the impact assessments were commissioned, I think it was around the end of February, beginning of March, and there was the workshop on the 6th of February. But I think the other point I would want to make is this was an intensely fast-moving period. You know, I had 42 years service. I cannot remember as demanding or challenging a period in my career as those 2 or 3 weeks. And when you think about it, we were planning for something that was changing on a daily basis. I don't think any of us had certainty that we would go into a full everyone must stay at home lockdown until that was announced by the Prime Minister on the Monday, the 23rd of March. So up to that point, the plans we were preparing would not necessarily have anticipated the type of lockdown that we were actually dealing with. So it may sound as if I'm being evasive here, but we were trying to work in a very fast-moving environment where things were changing rapidly on a daily basis. Plans that we would have produced at the end of February would have been on the basis of a pandemic flu, not the coronavirus that we had to deal with as it emerged.
We'll look at some of the material
Yes.
that was sent during that
Can I just
time.
interrupt for a second?
Sure.
I'm sorry. The passage that's still up on the screen, Sir David, as a principle, it just I'm not experienced in running these matters, obviously, but the principle of activating the NICMA arrangements, i.e. arrangements to deal with a catastrophic event, the principle of waiting until that event has arrived in Northern Ireland seems a little late to me.
I'm probably not explaining myself sufficiently.
No, just think, maybe it's the writer of this letter I should be asking, but you don't seem to have disagreed with the writer of this letter that it wasn't necessary to activate the NICMA arrangements unless or until the affection arrived in Northern Ireland. Isn't that a bit late?
When you're dealing with a catastrophic event of this nature, again, we still have, we still have the prepare, respond, recover phases. And you activate NICMA when you move into the respond. But the respond phase, in our judgment, really couldn't kick in much before the second week in March. Now, it's for the inquiry to conclude whether we were right in that assessment, but that was our judgment at the time. I have conceded,
The few days earlier.
I have conceded that we probably should have done it a few days earlier. I think I've conceded elsewhere that in early January, February, we weren't as prepared as we ought to have been. I acknowledge that.
Sorry to interrupt.
I'm grateful. So, David, I'm going to come to the point you were just making, because you've noted that in your bundle there was the message that you sent on the 5th of February. I think you'd been at a meeting in London, and what you recorded at the time was that the UK CMO had said at the meeting that you were at that the Chinese government hadn't got to grips with it, the COVID-19, and that it would almost certainly become a global pandemic. And I think we know there are a clutch of messages at around that time that all speak to that, I think, penny having dropped, that the situation was quite as serious as it was. Is that right as far as you're concerned, that that was a moment of importance? Yes,
and as we moved through February into March, there was more and more information which was alerting us to the gravity of the situation. But a point I think I need to make here is we were taking our lead from the UK government, and I think it was reasonable for us to do that. Northern Ireland is a population of 1.9 million people. We're a small regional administration. I think you acknowledged yesterday, my comparison was we are smaller than Greater Manchester. I think we had every right to put our faith in the UK government's ability to plan and manage this crisis, given the scientific and other resources they had available to them. We, in a sense, were looking what they were doing. And again, the Chief Medical Officer was building advice that was based on a presumption or an assumption that the transmission of the virus would lag by maybe, I think, up to 2 weeks between it coming to Northern Ireland. So that didn't create any complacency, but it did mean that we, I think, recognised that we might have a little bit more time just to do the things that would need to be done. I think you also got in your bundle a message that Dominic Cummings sent as well, I think at around exactly the same time, referring to the fact the chief scientist had told him it's probably out of control now and will sweep the world. And I think someone else in that message, which you will have seen, said the Cobra meeting was, I think, clear that China is probably losing it. So again, just to be clear, I think that you're saying that that was, again, your understanding at the time that you wrote your message. Yes.
That was the direction of travel, and obviously
yes.
that this was becoming extremely serious.
Yes.
If we just look, if we may then, Sorry, forgive me, Sir David. If we could just go then to the meeting that had taken place on the 30th of January, so it's slightly before that information came to you. And this is the meeting that Miss Bernie Rooney had noted. I think we've got that at 232515. And again, Sir David, I think you've seen this.
Yes.
And we see it's addressed to the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister. Would that have been sent? Would you have seen that at the time if it's addressed to
I
them?
think I was on the copy list for that.
All right. And as we can see, this relates to the Cobra meeting, which had taken place on the 29th of January. And if we could just go over the page, please. Forgive me, that's the wrong one. It's the one that ends 56166. Sorry, forgive me. I can... So, David, just quickly, this is linked to what I'm going to ask you about. This CRIP was referred to in Miss Rooney's note, which I will take you to. But can I just check, at the time that you were receiving updates from Cobra, were you receiving or were you seeing the documents that sat alongside them? So, in other words, these information pictures.
I'm not sure that I would have seen every CRIP that was produced, but I was getting a daily sit rep from the Cabinet Office, the Civil Contingencies Unit in the Cabinet Office. As I say, I got that first thing every morning. I can't remember exactly when it started, but it would have been around about this time.
All right, and I'm just going to see if I can bring up the correct document for you. Sorry, I haven't got anyone sitting beside me to check.
You said it was the one ending 56166.
Which I think is this, and I think the one that's 2515 has already, that's been brought up. It's the Bernie Rooney memo of the 30th of January. My lady, will you forgive me a second? There's two memos of the same date, so I just want to make sure we've got the right one. Could I just check what page 2 of that one is, please?
It certainly says provide an update on Cobra the day before.
And can we try page 3 of it? There we go. It was the right one. So if we just look at this, Sir David, this we can see is the update that Miss Rooney prepared. And you can see from the background that she set out what had happened, that there had been that meeting on the 29th of January. And if we just go to paragraph 4, please. So she set out what the current situation was having regard to that meeting, and refers to the fact that it was, and we see that at the first sub-paragraph, that it was spreading throughout China and globally. She referred to it being asymptomatic, and the vulnerability in terms of older people and those with an underlying illness. And if we just go over the page, please, again. She set out, and we go to paragraph 7. The planning assumptions, and we see there reference to all devolved administrations reviewing their reasonable worst-case scenario pandemic plans for preparedness. And if we could just go to the next page as well, please. And I think there should be a page after that as well. And again. And if we see on this page, she's setting out the agreed actions. And again, if we see paragraph 1, it's the next section, please. at the bottom of the page, paragraph 1. So we see there, Sir David, increased planning for a reasonable worst-case scenario using the pandemic flu assumptions as a starting point, with information that the elderly and those with existing health conditions will be disproportionately affected. And again, can I just ask then at that point whether your understanding was, or what you understood by the reasonable worst-case scenario at that stage? In other words, did you fully, or did you appreciate that that meant an uncontrolled outbreak stretching beyond China and into other countries?
Yes, I think that was something we were increasingly coming to recognise from that point onwards.
And what part did TEO play then in terms of the planning for the reasonable worst-case scenario at this point?
Well, again, given that this was a health pandemic, we would have been relying on the Department of Health as lead government department to prepare the plans to deal with the health impacts of the, what again was, I forgot the words they used there, but the reasonable worst case scenario that was being developed in London.
So again, is the answer to that that would have been seen purely as a health matter at that point of view, at that point in time, and not something that required the sort of cross-departmental approach foreseen by?
I wouldn't want, in me saying that, we would be looking to the Department of Health as lead government department. I wouldn't want that to be seen as us sort of washing our hands of having any responsibility. What I think I'm saying is that we would have been looking to the Department of Health to provide advice on how they were going to deal with the pandemic, and also to provide advice to us on what other departments would need to do as well.
Can we go to the next document, please? And this is
sorry, and saying that what other the issues that would face other departments, if you like. I'm not trying to suggest that the Department of Health had a particular responsibility that extended beyond their own department, but clearly their knowledge and understanding of the characteristics of the virus were going to be very important to all departments.
Can we just look then, please, at another document? This is INQ 000309096. So we've moved on now to the 17th of February. And if you see the second paragraph, so David, this sets out that Department of Health remains in the lead and has staffed up their DOC. However, there's now a need to make preparations for a wider response involving departments and other key stakeholders. And then as we read on down, there's some reference to some of the figures around planning. Yeah. And if we look at the third paragraph as well at the bottom line. So again, as well, this seems to be a communication at this point in time, suggesting that the sort of arrangements foreseen in the protocol needed to start or needed to kick in at this point. Do you agree?
Yes, although it's interesting that the RWCS at that time still envisaged an absentee rate of 17 to 20%, excuse me, which would have been consistent with what we would have expected in a pandemic flu. My point, I think, is that it was later than this that we, at this stage, it still wasn't clear just how difficult the COVID virus was going to be to manage.
I think, though, if we look at a document that bears the same date, and this is INQ 000398434. This is a document that you refer to in your witness statement at paragraph 117. So this is a script for the reasonable worst case scenario. And it sets out, it's the second substantive paragraph, not in the box, about the contingency planning being based on the knowledge that. So we can see there, for example, reference to the doubling rate, that sustained human-to-human transmission couldn't be ruled out. The fact that there was no vaccine. And then if we go down to the government, so this is in the last paragraph, please. So we see there a reference to 80% of the population, so that refers, I think, to the figure you've just referred to, the flu plan. But then if we go over the page, and if we go to paragraph 4, we see the reference then at the end of that paragraph to the fatality rate being 2 to 3% in terms of cases. Yes?
Yes.
So as I understand your evidence and your witness statement, that document was provided to you or to the TEO on the 17th of February.
Yes, yes.
So again, obviously the picture that is being presented here is one, I mean, it's making absolutely clear, isn't it, what the case fatality rate.
Well, that is the reasonable worst case scenario,
Yes.
which of course isn't a forecast.
No.
It's the worst case scenario. So we would have been, again, we were aware of that, but we would still have been looking to the Department of Health to, in a sense, advise what the implications of that were for us in Northern Ireland.
So are you saying then at the time this was being provided to you that notwithstanding that it's making clear what the potential fatality rate could be, and notwithstanding your own understanding and awareness that the virus had spread beyond China, and there was no question of that, that you didn't foresee or did not think that this was a realistic prospect, or that it was?
No. I'm not saying that at all, and I'm not, in any sense, playing down the significance of this. I think all I'm saying is that we would still have been looking, I suppose, at the highest level to UK government to see what they would have been doing in terms of planning for this. And then obviously we would have recognised that our own Department of Health was working in conjunction with UK government, or would have been getting an understanding of what might be necessary to actually deal with respond to the pandemic in that regard. We did have on the 3rd of March, the UK government's coronavirus action plan, and that did talk about the sort of contain and delay phases. So at this stage, we were still in the contain phase, where the management of the virus would have been through contact testing and tracing and that sort of thing. I think we didn't have the first case in Northern Ireland until the 27th of February. So we were looking at this in the context of what was actually happening. Knowing what we know now, should we have been doing more? I'm happy to accept that perhaps we should have been doing, but in the context we were in at the time, I wasn't being pressed to do anything more than we were actually doing at that time.
I mean, I think you've gotten straight to the heart of the matter, which is why this doesn't appear in Northern Ireland to have prompted any greater sense of urgency or galvanised any more central government planning in response to this.
No, I would probably have to accept that, yes, at that particular time, this was mid-February, yes.
The 17th of February.
Yeah, I would accept that that didn't prompt us in the Executive Office to do anything more. Now, having said that, Mr. Stewart and the CCPB team were working hard on the sectoral resilience issue, which has been mentioned before. And certainly, Mr. Stewart has advised me, and I've no reason to doubt him, that by early March, that sort of 18-month lag that we had in sectoral resilience preparation had been caught up. So it's not as if nothing was being done at this stage.
You've referred to the fact that obviously at this stage something like test and trace would have been the most important part of responding. How much insight or understanding was there, though, at the centre of government in Northern Ireland about the sort of capability that there even was at this point in time in order to be able to do that?
I'm not sure on the 17th of February we would have had a clear understanding of how much test and trace, contact tracing capability we had, nor how much would actually have been needed at that stage. But I think I would have to defer to Department of Health colleagues to just confirm what the position was at that time. Obviously, this was a new virus, and testing capability was, from my perspective, from my memory at that stage, was uncertain.
And I think it's right that there's certainly no sense, and we don't see any reference as such in the notes of the Executive Committee having any sort of role at this point in time in terms of overseeing what was being done, for example, in the Department of Health in order to prepare for this reasonable worst-case scenario eventuating.
No, and I think the expectation would be that the Department of Health was in the best position to manage this aspect of the emerging pandemic. We in the Executive Office wouldn't have been in a position to sort of second guess what the department was doing. I certainly had complete confidence in the Chief Medical Officer. I knew the Permanent Secretary and the Minister well. I thought they were a good team, and again, I thought it was reasonable at the time to place reliance on their ability to actually deal with the crisis as we knew it at that time.
And if we could go, please, I think this is the document at around the same time. This is dated the 27th of February. It's INQ 0000274690. And this is sent to you from the Civil Contingencies branch. And if we, on the first page, the second paragraph is note plans for the activation of the NI hub and the operations room. And then if we go over the page to paragraph 3, we see reference here to being asked to draw up plans for the reasonable worst case scenario, drawing on existing assumptions and emerging scientific advice in relation to the virus causing COVID-19. And then I think we see over the page, please, at paragraph 5. And if you just look at that, Sir David, reference to COVID-19 becoming more widespread, more impacts beginning to emerge, potential cumulative impact becoming more complex. Preparedness work being undertaken at pace, and I will come back and ask you about that. But there being a number of calls, as it were, for information and returns, yes. Yep. And then at 6, it's now essential that appropriate preparations for civil contingency arrangements are formally established. Correct?
Yes.
So that's by the 27th of February. But again, we still don't see a response to that because we know that the emergency arrangements still aren't set up for another couple of weeks. So why, with all of this information that was accumulating at this point in time in February, why is there still not any response in terms of the central civil contingencies arrangements being set up?
I'm perhaps not explaining myself well enough, but our view at the time was that setting up the hub, establishing the hub, and the civil contingencies group regular meetings was something that would not need to be done until we moved further into the response phase. We were still at the planning phase. We'd only had the first case in Northern Ireland on the 27th of February. So, as I say, I looked to the inquiry to conclude whether what we did was sufficient in the circumstances. All I'm doing is explaining that as we saw it at that time, there wasn't a need to put in place the response mechanisms at that particular time. And again, I'm not trying to duck any responsibility here, but we were not being asked to do so by the Department of Health for another couple of weeks.
If we could just ask on that, if we could look please at INQ 0003174435. If we could go to page 2 of that, please. And in fact, we may, just to put it in context, need to go over the page as well. So we can see here we've reached the 4th of March. There'd been a Cobra. And we see this third line down from Miss Rooney that Minister Swan and Dr. McBride were going to contact you to request ramping up the NI hub to support the executive, ! And if we go over the page, and if we go to page 2, please. We can see the message from Mr. Stewart back to her. Don't worry, one can only advise, others must decide. And if we can go to the first page in that, please. So this was your response to what was being sought by the Health Minister about ramping up the arrangements. You said we need to be smart about how to respond to this. A flat no will get back to the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister and be received badly. What was the reluctance on your part at this stage in the face of that request from them off the back of Cobra to setting up the arrangements?
I think the message I was getting was that what we were being asked to do was to set up something that would deal with calls that were coming in from businesses, etc., for advice. And I think our conclusion, it's somewhere else, is that there are other ways in which we could deal with that using NI Direct, NI Business Info, etc., and that we should look at that. So I didn't read this as the Minister of Health and the CMO calling for the NICMA arrangements to be activated in full at that time. And certainly I wasn't contacted in that sense either.
Well, it does say in terms they're going to contact David Sterling to request ramping up of the NI hub to support the executive. Yep. And I think by her exclamation mark, that was regarded as quite a big thing.
I think the exclamation marks come at virtually every sentence, to be fair.
Yes.
Yes.
So, in other words, it is very specific about setting, it's a specific email about setting up the hub. It doesn't seem to be about setting up business lines or, I mean, obviously the hub plays a very different role.
Yes. Well, look, I As I say, I didn't respond to this. I didn't consider that we needed to set up the hub just exactly at that stage. And there wasn't actually a formal communication from the CMO for another week or so after that in that regard. So perhaps I should have checked with the CMO at this stage exactly what it was that was meant. But I think and again, I would say this was at a period of time where things were moving very quickly. I can't remember exactly what I did in response to every email, etc., that I was getting at that time. But I may well have concluded that, look, the CMO is going to get in touch with me, and he didn't do so.
All right, and we'll come back to some more of the communications at around this time. I just wanted to pick up on something that you did mention, which was the UK-wide coronavirus action plan. You mentioned that just a short time ago.
Yes.
Can I ask you some questions about that? In paragraph 130 of your witness statement, you suggested that it was around the time, and I think you confirmed at the very start of your evidence, that it was now becoming obvious that there would be important differences between preparing for Covid-19 and preparing for a pandemic flu plan. Is that notwithstanding the information that had been sent to you on the 17th of February, for example, about the case fatality rate and about the reasonable worst case scenario? Were you still working on the basis at the start of March, that in fact it was the flu pandemic plans?
I think
were relevant, and that this would look something like a flu pandemic.
By the beginning of March, I think we had recognised that this was going to be more serious than a flu pandemic, but we hadn't, I think, fully appreciated exactly what would be required in response to that. And again, we would have been looking to UK government for a steer on what actions were appropriate. If you roll forward a couple of weeks, we went into full lockdown. My view is that Northern Ireland could not have moved into lockdown before the UK did, for a variety of reasons. So we were always going to take our lead from what was happening in London.
Just on that then, can we look at the communications that you were being sent by Cabinet Office at this time then? If we go to INQ 000309229, and if we could go to page 9, please. I think you're probably familiar with this, Sir David. This was the email that was sent, and it's the second email in a series that was sent around this time. I'm just going to use it because it's the easiest way in. It was the email that asked all government departments and the devolved administrations to send back a return. And it set out what it wanted each to consider, paragraphs 1, 2 and 3.
Yes.
And I won't read out all of it, but obviously it's set out. We can see in the paragraphs below, it wanted information on what the impact of those measures would be. It asked whether or not there would be regional impacts, and at the very bottom it said, are there specific implications for devolved policy areas and devolved administrations? And I think if we then go to page 6, we can see just at the bottom, we can go on to see the rest of this over the page. Thank you. We can see the reaction from Mr. Stewart, and I think Derek and Tracy is a reference to 2 permanent secretaries, correct?
That's correct, yes. Education and communities. Yeah.
he starts, brace yourselves. So obviously this wasn't something that he was expecting, correct?
Well, he was, I think, recognising this was going to be a challenge for the two departments.
And if we can just work our way up this email chain, please. We see that there's a reply from Mr. Baker. If we could just go slightly further up, please. So what he says, we can see he replies at around 6:30 that evening, that it would be impossible for him to answer any of those questions from the perspective of the Department of Education. And in fact, he goes on to say that the questions are unanswerable as far as the Department of Education is concerned. And if we can just go up a bit more, I think he provides some more information. And if we could just scroll up. And a bit, and to the next bit of the chain, please. Thank you. And just so that we can see the start of that email, please, that starts, "It's a matter of fact." So we see then that the CMO replies to this email, correct?
Yes.
And we see that he indicates in the second paragraph that there wasn't the modelling capability to replicate and provide such granularity. We see at the third paragraph, he says that the timeframes are unrealistic, that it wasn't possible to provide any meaningful analysis. He didn't know why that was regarded as a must-do, and that it was a marathon and not a sprint. And at the next paragraph, we see that he refers to the fact that this is on the back of what had happened in, or what was happening in England, correct? And then at the next paragraph, he refers to the fact that there was evidence of deeply troubling and significant community transmission in the Republic of Ireland, but that Northern Ireland was probably a few weeks behind. So can I just ask you, please, about this? This obviously indicates that notwithstanding it's a Cabinet Office communication to the TEO seeking a response on the issues that it had set out in terms of potential non-pharmaceutical interventions and asking for information about their possible impact. It's the CMO who intervenes to say that Northern Ireland couldn't respond. And I think, in fact, it's right that that wasn't responded to for that reason.
Not immediately. I think we did put a response in, but it was 2 or 3 days late.
I think eventually you respond on the 9th of March to this, but just focusing on that, it's the CMO who effectively says we shouldn't be replying to this, correct?
That's, yes.
And was it right that there was simply no capability in Northern Ireland to responding to this, or was the fact that you were able to respond within a few days an indication that, in fact, you could?
Well, the fact is that we did respond. I'm not sure in this particular instance I would have agreed exactly with what the CMO is saying here. It's rare that I would disagree with the CMO, but in a sense, I understand where he's coming from in that this was an impossibly short deadline, and we probably didn't have the data analysis capability that ideally we would like to have had. So I understand those points, but clearly we were in a position to provide a response, albeit on the 9th rather than the 7th, I think was the requested date.
I won't take you to it now, but there are a series of messages about this, because I think you were contacted by Mr. Stewart to say we're being pressed for this information, and that it was a choice between annoying the Cabinet Office or annoying the CMO, to which you replied, my advice would be to annoy the Cabinet Office rather than the CMO, and you can hold me to that. that rather suggests that when it came to the CMO, that the relationship was such that there was that not incurring his annoyance was the most important thing at this point.
Yeah,
Can you help a bit with that?
I wouldn't want to overread the particular point I was making here. Again, when you see something like that in a room like this, you do quite rightly raise eyebrows. But I would say that in the context we were working at the time, I actually don't remember writing that now, but I clearly did write it. It was an instantaneous response to something that came across my desk. And as I say, I wouldn't read too much into it. The reality is, even if the CMO hadn't intervened there, I doubt we would have been able to provide a response on the 7th as requested. I think we were only being given 1 day's notice or something like that. So set aside what I said about not annoying the CMO, we did get a response in, as I say, albeit a couple of days late.
There is another chain in this email. I don't know if we've got time to go to it before the break.
Up to you, whatever suits you.
Let's see if we can get through this before the break. If we go to INQ 00039 8439. And I think so. What we see is that there is pressure being applied by the Cabinet Office that this response was 3 hours overdue and they hadn't had it. I mean, that obviously suggests that there was an urgency on the part of the Cabinet Office and that this was regarded as important information.
Yes, and I never like to miss a deadline, but it happens, and I regret that, but it wouldn't have been the only deadline that we missed. As I say, we were being asked to move at unbelievably rapid pace on a whole range of areas at that time.
Forgive me, it wasn't that the CMO was saying delay, respond, we need a few days. He was advising at this point in time, we can't respond. We just don't have this data. I mean, what he says in that email is we'll wait for the next SAGE update. So it's not a question of being a bit late. It's a question of not responding because you've been advised.
Yeah, well, I can't remember exactly what it is we responded with, but we would have responded to the best of our ability with the information we had at that time.
Could we please just go up in this chain of the email, please? And up again, please. And up again so that we get to the start of it. So we can see this is an email from you on the 8th of March. And I think that your responses are set out in red, is that right?
No, mine is the blue. The red
see.
responses are Mr. Stewart.
I see. So what we can see from here in terms of what the advice was and the basis upon which you were working at that time, we can see very clearly that as of the 8th of March, his advice was, and we see that at the second line, we should not move to delay here immediately. Yes?
Sorry, this is the second line of the first point.
Paragraph.
Sorry, I had jumped ahead. Yes.
So in other words, the advice as at the 8th of March was Northern Ireland was still in the contain phase, correct?
Yes, and my recollection is UK government moved from contain to delay on the 12th of March.
And then at paragraph 3, Cabinet Office request for impacts and mitigations analysis. The CMO has advised that there is no particular need for this work to be completed. Impossible to produce. And then you point to the fact that there was a need to mend fences with the Cabinet Office. And and then the fear that that was going to come to the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister, that hadn't been replied to.
I'm sorry, Sir David, I'm not following how yours can be the blue. Forgive me, it's an email from you to Mr Stewart.
Yes.
8th of March, 12:55.
He has replied to me by annotating my email with red comments.
That's what I initially thought you meant. Sorry to interrupt you. But if you look at the top, the heading is, it's from you. Wouldn't it be from her to you if she'd annotated it?
No, sorry. It
looks as if you've annotated it, doesn't it?
It's from me to Chris Stewart, who's male. And then, so I'm colourblind here, just in case I get this wrong.
That's going to help a lot.
I think if we scroll up as well, I think we can see the points, Sir David.
Oh, okay. So you're
yes.
entirely happy.
Yes,
Sorry,
no,
right.
I'm...
Forget what I said. I've obviously entered into dangerous territory, especially colour blindness.
So, just looking at paragraph 4 then, Sir David,
yes.
I think we're moving on to a slightly different point. There was an issue at this point in time with travel to Italy. I don't know if you recollect that.
Yes.
But there was concern because people were still able to travel back from Italy into Northern Ireland. And I think that it's right that I think certainly the Deputy First Minister was concerned about that.
Yes.
And I think, in fact, Mr. Baker of the Department of Education was also concerned about that as well. But we see reference in this part of the reply to the fact that Minister Swan had asked for the hub to be set up for centralised decision-making as well, and that it was still being explained at this point on the 8th of March that stand-up would be premature. Is that right?
Yes, that's Chris Stewart's comment, yes.
But correct that Minister Swan was asking for the hub to be stood up, and it remained Mr. Stewart's advice on the 8th of March that there wasn't, that would be premature.
Yes, Chris Stewart is saying that Derek Baker from Education approached him indicating he had already, yeah. Yes, sir, I don't think I have anything to add to it. Yeah.
No, but I mean, the point is it's the 8th of March,
yes.
Sir David. Covid-19 was obviously well and truly in Northern Ireland, and yet at this stage there's still a reluctance to set up one of the most basic components of the civil contingencies arrangements in Northern Ireland, and it would appear despite the fact that the Minister of Health himself was asking for them to be set up.
Yeah. This might sound... I don't want to be overly defensive of my position here. If the inquiry concludes that we got this wrong, I will accept that. At the time, my judgment was we were still very much in preparing for something that was coming. I don't think I'm explaining clearly enough the role that the hub had. The hub is not a planning mechanism, it's a response mechanism. It is there, it works in conjunction with departmental operating centres. So the hub, in a sense, is collecting information about what is happening on the ground. We weren't at the position where that was, in my view, necessary. But as I say, if the conclusion is that I got that wrong, and I've already conceded we should have done it a few days earlier. I don't recall Minister Swan approaching me directly to say you should set up the hub. And I would have been seeing him and the Permanent Secretary and the Chief Medical Officer on a regular basis. So yes, there's evidence here that they were asking me to do this, but they weren't pushing me, which leads me to conclude if it had been a really big issue for them, they would have come to me directly. All
right. I don't want to lead you into mistake. I'm afraid I also have very, very bad eyesight. It may be that that line is slightly ambiguous, that it's either Robin Swan or Mr. Baker, the Permanent Secretary.
Well, I think it is actually Mr. Baker.
But is that not even more important that the Permanent Secretary to the Department of Education is asking for the central arrangements to be set up?
Well, again, yes, it's significant. Derek didn't approach me, and I can't remember whether we would still having weekly permanent secretary meetings. And had it been a major issue, I'm pretty sure Derek, who I had very good relations with, would have been in touch with me.
I think that's probably a good moment for a
Certainly.
break.
I shall return at 20 past. Story.
Thank you. So, David, I wonder if I could take you, please, to the next document, which is INQ 00008695. You talked earlier about the planning that was going on behind the scenes whilst the civil contingency arrangements hadn't been activated. And I think we certainly see here, this is version 2 of a resilience return. I don't know if it had been prepared or if it was linked to the cabinet, any cabinet office communications. But what this appears to be is drawing together the principal concerns and setting out what the potential impacts would be. Is this a document that you recognise?
I do, yes. And I think it's coincidental to the request from the Cabinet Office for Returns.
Right.
This is work that we had commissioned independently ourselves. That's my recollection at the time.
So if we look at, for example, just taking the very first entry on that page, we can see that in terms of economy and business, closure of businesses is the issue. The risk is loss of jobs, loss of labour. Impacts increased unemployment, and no potential mitigations are set out there. I mean, this doesn't look like any kind of developed or considered plan, or, I mean, it looks as though it's a really basic document. Do you agree?
Yes, I would agree, and that probably reflects the fact that this being completed at the beginning of March, there wouldn't have been a lot of clarity about exactly what was going to happen and what mitigations might be possible to put in place.
This is the 13th of March, so it's not the beginning.
Yeah, it's a version 2, so it's probably an amended. I think I saw an earlier version which was dated earlier than that. I suppose my point would be here that I think it was the 18th of March that, maybe the 19th, that, no, I can't remember, it might have been that week, the Chancellor announced the financial support that would be provided to business. And I think for our own Department of the Economy, there would have been very limited actions they could take to support business in the event of major closure due to absence, or, as it turned out, to businesses being told, unless you're absolutely essential, you must close. So, in one sense, I'm not surprised the document is as it reads there at that time.
But I mean, one might have thought that if you didn't know what central government was going to do, all the more greater need to have your own potential mitigations thought through and developed in a properly detailed set of plans.
I couldn't argue that's entirely rational, but just at the time, the Economy Department would have been wrestling with still a fair amount of uncertainty as to exactly what was going to happen to individual businesses. I think I've made clear in my witness statement that I did not see any realistic prospect that Northern Ireland would move ahead of the UK government in terms of lockdown or partial lockdown. And I think there are three factors in that regard that need to be taken into account. For such a thing to happen, first of all, the Chief Medical Officer would have had to have recommended it. The second option would have been for the political parties to come together to agree that they decided to put in place a lockdown. And then the third factor that would have been needed would have been some mitigating measures, essentially finance to compensate businesses for being forced to close down. None of those three factors, in my view, were likely at that particular time. So that's why I have said on a number of occasions that I never saw Northern Ireland moving ahead of UK government in terms of its response to the pandemic as it emerged.
But this isn't about taking a decision that preempts the one made by the UK government. This is about planning for what might actually happen, about which you had had warning over a number of weeks before reaching this point.
Yes, and we were relying on individual departments to make assessments about what might be done in each of these areas based on the knowledge that they had at that time. So, I would accept some of this looks light in terms of departmental or governmental response, but I think you need to recognise there was limitations on what departments could actually do at that particular time.
Could we look at page 30 of this document, please? It relates to schools. So again, this is the first page of the part of the return that had been provided by the Department of Information. And we can see that a key area of concern is school closures. The issue is foreseen as absenteeism of staff. The risk is regarded as a lack of staff to teach. And then potential impact, disruption to curriculum, children losing food, loss of business to transport companies, and the potential mitigation is larger class sizes and a substitute register. So, even the planning at this stage, when it talks about school closures, it's because of a risk that there may not be teachers, as opposed to any risk that children might not be able to go to school because there will be a closure of education.
My recollection isn't entirely clear, but my assumption is that this was prepared on the basis of an expectation that there would have been absenteeism of around 20% or more amongst teachers. This wasn't constructed on the basis that schools would be instructed to close.
But that's what I'm asking. Why isn't that being addressed in this document that's setting out the potential mitigations, having regard to the risks that might arise?
Because at that time, rightly or wrongly, there was no expectation nor instruction that schools should plan on the basis that they're going to be closed for a significant period of time.
I think we can see, I won't go back to it, that the potential for school closures had been raised by SAGE a considerable period before this. Are you saying that that message had never filtered through to Northern Ireland, that that was something that might have to be done in the eventuality?
We may well have been aware at the time that there were suggestions from SAGE that schools might have to close, but we had no indication from the UK government that this was likely to become a policy that would be recommended either in England or in GB or in the UK as a whole. So when the Department of Education was preparing this, again, knowing what we know now, it may have been that we should have been saying to them, please prepare a plan which assumes that you're told to close schools. But that was something we did not foresee at this particular time in early March.
Was it foreseen before the decision was actually made by the UK government that schools would close on the 18th of March?
It was because, as you will recall, the sequence of events began on the 12th of March when the Taoiseach announced that Irish schools were to close for a period of, I think it was several weeks, and that led to particular difficulties within the executive because there were differences of view on whether Northern Ireland should follow suit. And I'm compressing a very difficult period of several days into a couple of sentences. The issue was only in a sense resolved in Northern Ireland on the 18th of the Taoiseach made his announcement on Thursday, the 12th of March. Gavin Williamson, the Secretary of State for Education in England, announced that schools would be closed from, let's say, the end of that week. So it was the 20th of March. And given a decision that had been taken at the executive, albeit on a vote, on the Monday evening of the 16th of March, Northern Ireland followed suit. So there was only the period of time in which it became clear that there was a probability rather than a possibility of school closure emerged. It was a very short period of time. As I say, kicking off on the 12th of March.
So just to be clear about that, it was because the Republic of Ireland had done that it became something that you regarded as realistic for Northern Ireland?
Yes.
Okay. I am going to ask you about that and about what happened on the 12th of March. But just coming back to the point that you made about, and it post-dates what happened on the 12th of March, but I do just want to pick it up whilst we're at this point. I think it's right that there was the Executive Committee meeting on the 16th of March.
Yes.
So it post-dated the decision in the Republic of Ireland. And it's right that one of the ministers essentially put to the vote whether Northern Ireland should close its schools on that date. Is that right?
That's correct, was the Finance Minister.
And prior to that, there would only have been a couple of days, obviously, before the Republic of Ireland had made its announcement. Had there been any contemplation about the closure of schools or meaningful discussion about the closure of schools prior to that?
Not that I recall. I got the call from the Secretary-General to the Taoiseach around about lunchtime on the Thursday. The Taoiseach had made the announcement in Washington, D.C., so they were 5 hours behind us. I think he'd made the announcement at 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning. So I had got around 20 minutes notice of that announcement. I instantly advised the First Minister, Deputy First Minister. We were in Stormont Castle that day. We had a discussion about this. I had got advice. I can't remember whether I got it directly from the Chief Medical Officer or indirectly, but the advice I was getting from the Chief Medical Officer was that they did not believe there were grounds for closing the schools in Northern Ireland. I relayed that information to the First Minister and Deputy First Minister.
Pause you there, because let's have a look at the document that records that. This is INQ 000 232525. And I think we see at the first paragraph that you clarified there are no medical scientific evidence to support measures announced by the Taoiseach earlier today. Expect Cobra will confirm UK measures later today.
Yes, sir. Can I just be clear here? Some have construed this as I was giving medical advice. The note of that meeting could have been amplified a little. I was simply passing on the advice I had received from the Department of Health. And as I say, I can't remember whether I got it directly from the Chief Medical Officer or from one of the senior team in the Department of Health. But what I had asked was my recollection is that the Permanent Secretary, the Minister of Health and the Chief Medical Officer were in the Assembly. And I asked them to leave whatever meeting they were in urgently to come and brief the First Minister and Deputy First Minister which they did. I think they were a little annoyed with me that I had pulled them out of a meeting, but I saw that this was a highly significant issue that was going to prove difficult for the executive. So they then joined a reconvened meeting, and I think the rest of the minute records
Yes, I
what
think
was
I was going to
said
say
at
if we
that.
could perhaps go on to the next page. So I think we can see that, and it's the third paragraph down. So Minister Swan said that containment measures were working in Northern Ireland and that following the Republic of Ireland position would crash the NHS and create unnecessary panic and fear. Is that correct? Does that accord with your recollection?
Yes, broadly. Yeah.
And does that in fact demonstrate what the position was at that time? I mean, we're at the 12th of March, that it was regarded as correct that containment was working in Northern Ireland.
That's what was recorded there, yes.
I mean, it's also right, I think, that on that day, test and trace was stopped in Northern Ireland.
That's correct.
So
that was the same day that the UK as a whole moved from contain to delay.
So how was it reconcilable that containment was working in Northern Ireland, yet there was no need for test and trace to remain on foot?
I would have to defer to Department of Health on that.
And what was your understanding on this day about the reasons why test and trace was stopping in Northern Ireland, if in fact containment was working?
Well, I think it was tied into the movement from contain to delay. But I think, and again, I stand to be corrected on this, there was limited capacity for extensive testing and tracing. And this was across the UK as a whole. The testing kits were in, I think, reasonably short supply. And certainly, you may recall, this became a big issue at UK level with the Secretary of State for Health being pressed on the need to have, I can't remember what the number was, it's something like 100,000 tests available a day, but they simply were not available at this time.
I think there's 2 points that arise from that. The first point is you're saying it was linked to the fact that the UK government had said that this was the end of containment, we're moving to delay. Why did that need to be followed in Northern Ireland if that wasn't in fact the position in Northern Ireland as was being said on that day?
Well, as I say, I cannot recall exactly why the Department of Health concluded that testing should end that day. I simply don't know whether their rationale was because of the movement from contain to delay, or whether there are other factors such as the lack of capacity for extensive testing.
But I mean, given your role, is that not something that would have been of vital importance? I mean, in terms of understanding, have we actually reached the point where we don't have the capacity to test more people?
And apologies, it's the passage of time that is leaving me with a certain uncertainty about exactly what the reasons were. I'm pretty sure on the day I would have known more about that.
I think then, in terms of what happened after this, I'm just going to go back to this point about the meeting on the 16th of March, if I may. So that meeting took place amongst the Executive Committee, and obviously it was being pressed by some ministers that there ought to be a decision to close schools in Northern Ireland because that decision had been made in the Republic of Ireland, correct?
Yes, and it's probably worth recognising that it was foreseeable on Monday that this was going to be difficult, because if you roll forward from Tuesday afternoon, there was a press conference on Thursday, the evening of Thursday the 12th, where the First Minister and Deputy First Minister showed a certain amount of unanimity in the approach, which essentially was that schools would be closed whenever it was considered appropriate in Northern Ireland. So it wasn't so much that schools weren't going to be closed, it was a matter about timing. But then there were different messages were being sent out in the media from Thursday evening and through Friday, so we could see that there was going to be a difficult meeting on Monday.
And we've already discussed one vote, which was whether or not to close schools. The vote that was carried at that meeting was a vote that the closure of schools should be handled in accordance with the CMO's advice. Do you recollect that?
I do, yes.
So in other words, what the ministers were saying was we're not going to decide whether or not to close schools. We'll essentially, the vote will be, we will await the advice and we'll act in accordance with it, correct?
Correct.
So in other words, that it wasn't essentially a decision for them, that they would do whatever the CMO said about it. Correct?
Yes, that's correct, yes.
And was there...
Sorry, the vote wasn't carried unanimously.
It wasn't carried, but it was carried.
It was carried.
And it was that schools would be handled in accordance with the CMO's advice.
Yes.
It wasn't, we'll await his advice. It would be in accordance with his advice.
Yes, and that was why on the Wednesday, whenever the Secretary of State for Education in England decided that schools should close from the end of that week, the fact that a decision had been taken to follow CMO's advice on the Wednesday was we should follow suit. And therefore, there didn't need to be another executive meeting. The First Minister, Deputy First Minister, essentially acting on the advice of the Chief Medical Officer, agreed that Northern Ireland would follow suit. And the announcement was that schools in Northern Ireland would close from the Friday evening.
But effectively, that precludes them having a role or discussing whether or not that's right for Northern Ireland. It becomes a decision for the CMO, not them.
Well, yes, but ministers will always take decisions on the basis of the advice they receive. They won't always accept the advice they receive, and that's perfectly right. So long as there is an explanation as to why they have taken the particular decision. But in this case, my view was that the Secretary of State for Education in England, having taken that decision, got the executive off a hook. They were clearly not in agreement as to how schools should close, but essentially the decision having been taken that schools essentially across UK and Ireland were going to close made it easy for them to move forward. And, sorry, I should say, I have been quoted in the media today about my concerns about ministerial decision taking, and that was probably the most difficult 2 or 3 days that I experienced during the first wave. But what I would like to say is that from there on, in fact, from the following Monday onwards, whenever we went into full lockdown, I actually found that ministers were working together on a much more collegiate basis. We had long discussions at times, and we had the Chief Scientific Advisor, the Chief Medical Officer, probed at length on a range of issues. But by and large, decisions were reached, albeit after a period of time. And I think the executive did work much more collegiately from that point onwards. So I just think it's important to just correct that sort of line that has been running in the media.
Well, I wonder if you're looking at that with slight rose-tinted glasses, David.
Well, yes, I know you're going to point to various comments that I've made at various times. And, certainly there were many points of difficulty after that. But by and large, we got through them.
Well, I'm going to take you to something that I think suggests that maybe it was a bit more fundamental than that. But before I do, you've obviously foreseen that I'm going to ask you about your comment.
Yes.
That meeting on the 16th of March was excruciating.
Yes.
No leadership on display. This is at the very earliest staging post. This was the first decision that ministers had been called to make. And this was the way that it went. What was excruciating about it?
Well, it was a protracted discussion. People had got into fixed positions it had split along nationalist unionist lines. My frustration, as expressed in a message that night, was born of a concern that this might be how things played out from here on. Now, there were difficulties on occasion afterwards, but by and large, not of that magnitude. And fortunately, in most issues, things didn't necessarily break down along unionist nationalist lines.
Can we look at a document that might suggest why that was the case? This is INQ 000 309 200. And I think it's the third bulletproof, didn't mean that, third
Yes.
bullet down. You say this in terms, our ministers have not shown strong leadership and have been too quick to retreat into campaigning or community activist mode. They've gotten away with this, partly because UKG has thrown so much money at mitigation that they haven't had to take many difficult decisions. Yet when they have, for example, school closure and defining essential businesses, they've been found wanting. The irritation of the minor parties is likely to increase. There's a truth in that, isn't there? That effectively any big decisions that the government in Northern Ireland had to make were effectively superseded by the fact that they were taken by the government in Westminster, correct?
That is true. And again, I think it's just worth recognising our context, where we have 5 parties in an enforced coalition, very different ideologies, very different aspirations for this place. Having to work together. But what I think is important to recognise is that on all the big issues, they eventually did reach decisions. And I think one of the strengths of our arrangement is that when decisions were reached, the 5 parties represented just short of 90% of the electorate. So it was painstaking. It was difficult at times, but decisions were taken, and I think it's important to recognise at the high level that by and large we introduced the restrictions in line with elsewhere in the UK. We developed a process for agreeing to the easing of those restrictions. The Guide to Decision Making, which was published on the 12th of May, I think was a good document. I think it was as clear as the similar documents that were produced in GB. And I think that we moved to ease restrictions by and large in line with GB and with Ireland. So, yes, it was difficult. It was clunky, it was awkward, time-consuming, but we got there. And I think recognition needs to be given to that.
So in terms of the big decisions that you've said that the executive committee made, what big decisions would you point to as demonstrating their ability to come together as a cohesive whole, given that they didn't really make the decisions at the outset of the pandemic, they were made for them?
I think there were lots of different views about how we should approach the easing and removal of restrictions. It was quite a tortuous process to agree the Guide to Decision Taking, which was published on the 12th of May. But through sort of hard work with the parties, we actually got that document agreed. And again, the handling of individual proposals for reducing restrictions were worked through. Again, it was painstaking at time, but we did get agreement on that.
So that's agreement about a framework about how you will make decisions.
It's agreement about the framework, and it's then the agreements that followed on the individual issues within that framework.
So in other words, you mean the decisions to reopen different parts of
Correct.
society. And I think that process would have been ongoing in and around the time that you actually retired in August.
Yes.
So you weren't in situ and you weren't in place for the more difficult decisions effectively that had to be made in the autumn of 2020?
No, and I didn't foresee at that time, that the autumn would be a difficult period.
I think you'll agree, though, that certainly before you went, and it was being flagged at a very early stage by the CMO, and I think, in fact, the framework for coming out of restrictions was predicated upon this, was the fact that a second wave was foreseen and regarded as highly...
Oh, yes, sorry. When I said I didn't foresee the difficulties in the autumn, that doesn't mean I didn't foresee there would be a second wave. I think even at the time I left, there was a sort of marked increase in transmission, etc. So I think it was foreseeable. Yeah.
2 points. I think the first one was it was flagged at a very early stage that coming out of lifting the restrictions would lead, or there was a real risk that there would be a second wave. And I think, as you rightly say, by the time you left in August, in fact, the rates were already starting to go up by that point. And I'm going to go to a very different topic, if I may, and to ask you about the role of the Department of Health as the lead department. And I wanted to ask you about a specific communication, and this is INQ 000287-536. And I think you might need to go down a little bit, please. Yes. This is an email from you towards the end of March. And it's the second paragraph that I'm interested in on behalf of the inquiry, Sir David.
Sorry, which one is this?
It's
DFN wants to move to a 3?
Yes.
Yeah. That's the 26th of March. Yes.
Also the paragraph after that about ministers being worried about being held corporately responsible or liable if things go badly wrong. So can I just ask you some questions about this? I mean, first of all, that first paragraph also would tend to speak to an issue I asked you questions about at the very outset, this idea of the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister not having control, as it were, over the Department of Health, or the Department of Health having its own operational mandate and operating within it. I mean, can you just help? Was that the position at the end of March, as conveyed in that email, that they didn't feel that they had sufficient?
No, very much so. I got a very clear sense from particularly the Deputy First Minister that, and then the First Minister as well, that they wanted to be seen to have grip over the totality of the issues around the Covid-19 pandemic. And we at this particular time, following the lockdown, just before the lockdown, this requires a bit of an explanation, but in the run-up to the 23rd, it was quite clear that we were going to need to change the daily rhythm, if you like. And what we did with the agreement of the First and Deputy First Minister, we moved to an arrangement whereby the day started with a civil contingencies group meeting at 8:30, which I chaired, and which all departments dialed into, along with local authorities, the Northern Ireland Office, the police, the Fire and Rescue Service, the ambulance service. And First Minister, Deputy First Minister or the junior ministers used to join that. And that gave them an opportunity to hear at first hand what was happening on the ground. And again, issues were raised there. If they didn't require executive decision, they went on to an action log, which CCG maintained and which we updated on a daily basis. So we then moved from there to the executive meetings, which we reformed for a period of 6 days.
Yes.
And we called those executive COVID crisis management meetings. And they weren't meetings designed to take decisions. They were meetings that were designed to give ministers a greater oversight of what was happening outside the health domain. So using a piece of risk analysis that was done by Karen Pearson and her team, we identified some of the highest risk areas outside the health sphere, and we asked ministers to give presentations on how they were going to address those. And that was across the 7 other departments apart from health. And it was during that, those proved useful, but it was during that period that, again, I think the Deputy First Minister was again making a case to us that she wanted to be sure that the executive was always managing this. So what we did was the health department had agreed to produce a strategy which was the Department of Health strategy for dealing with the health aspects of the pandemic. That was produced around the end of March, the beginning of April. I can't remember exactly when. And then that sat alongside the various action plans which the departments themselves had identified that they were putting in place to deal with the wider impacts. So when we went through those 6 ECCMC meetings, it was agreed that we would move back to a rhythm of having 3 executive meetings a week. So then the daily rhythm was CCG meeting 8:30, executive meeting 3 days a week at 10 o'clock, press conference jointly hosted by the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister and/or the Health Minister in the afternoon, and with attendance at the Assembly to give readout to the Assembly committees as appropriate. And that rhythm ran for most of April and into May. I think worth noting that the Executive was also provided, when it met with all ministers were provided with a daily situation report from CCG and also with an update on the action points which CCG were dealing with as well. So that was the process that we entered into, and again, the Deputy First Minister may wish to correct me in this, but my impression was that they did have greater confidence from that point on that the totality of issues that were being addressed by departments were being addressed, and certainly she said to me at the time that she got value out of attending the CCG meetings every morning just to get a sense that things were being gripped on a cross-departmental basis.
Because I think we'll see, we know that there was the Executive Committee meeting on the 18th of March, and I think that's the one where we see evidence, or certainly the notes would tend to reflect that ministers didn't think that they were in control of what had happened thus far, and we see reference to them saying we're in reactive mode. And I think it's the meeting where Minister Swan says, we've been preparing for 7 weeks, which one assumes was a reference to to the Department of Health. Is that right?
Yes, I guess so, yeah.
And again, can I just check that that was your understanding as well? By the time they got to that point, ministers felt that they hadn't been sufficiently in control of what had been going on until that point in time.
I'm hesitant to express a view on what all ministers' view was at the time. There wouldn't have been a collective view amongst ministers about this, but I know certainly the Deputy First Minister and her team had concerns that they didn't have sufficient understanding of all that the Department of Health was doing. And I think it was in response to that the Minister of Health brought forward a strategy that was to cover a period of, I can't remember, I think it was 2 or 3 months. It was, that was the sort of horizon for that strategy. And again, I can't remember exactly when that was, but I think it was early April. Other ministers would have had concerns as well, but I wouldn't like to just characterise exactly what the executive's concern was as a whole.
All right, well, we can ask those ministers. One of the other things that happened before that you retired, which I wanted to touch on before my learned friends ask you some questions, was the Story funeral and the attendance of the Deputy First Minister at that. And I think it's clear from your witness statement that that was something that caused difficulties or schisms within the Executive Committee. Is that correct?
Yes. I'm not going to comment on the issue itself. All I would observe is that it did cause divisions, and the atmosphere in the executive was difficult after that. One of the most immediate practical implications was that the joint press conferences, which took place most afternoons by First Minister and Deputy First Minister, they stopped. And that was significant because the feedback we got from the sort of attitude surveys, etc., that we were doing was that the community found those press conferences very helpful, very reassuring, and it was a very visible manifestation of ministers working together, and the absence of that, I think, did reduce public confidence for a period of time. I think they did resume later, but there was certainly a period of weeks before that happened.
And can I just ask you, I mean, you obviously look at this from the perspective as being an interlocutor in that relationship as well, between Deputy First Minister and First Minister. I mean, did you observe then a fracturing in their relationship from that point onwards?
Yes, you could people on the outside perhaps don't fully understand that even parties who are diametrically opposed on a whole range of issues, they can actually work together quite well behind the scenes. But there was a discernible chill after that.
And did that affect then how the Executive Office worked, if there was that division between them?
Business was still transacted, but I think I made the point, the most practical manifestation of the chill was the fact that the joint press conferences ended after that. But business was still, as I say, issues were still brought to the executive, discussions still took place, decisions were taken. I don't recall that became any more difficult than it had been.
But it must make a difference having two people in those positions who are able to get on with each other and having a normal working relationship with each other. I mean, it can't be helpful to government business to have that relationship.
It wasn't helpful.
And in what sense was it not helpful? What did it mean? Asides the press conference, what impact did it have on day-to-day work?
I can't point to any tangible examples of things that didn't happen because of it. No, I'm honestly,
But generally, then, I think you're saying it had
generally,
an impact.
it's just it's harder to do business whenever the relationship is not as it should be.
And did you try to resolve that or reconcile the two offices, so to speak?
I didn't see myself as a peacemaker in that regard, but certainly the helpful discussions I would have had would have been with the two lead special advisors on both sides, and we would have met most Friday afternoons, and that would have been the way I think I would have had most traction. But this was one of those issues that was only ever going to work itself out over time.
And had it resolved itself by the time of your retirement?
I can't recall whether the joint press conferences had resumed by the time I retired, but that did happen around about that time, I think.
All right. My lady, I think I need to allow some time for my learned friends to ask questions.
Right, certainly. Is it Ms Campbell or Mr Wilcock? Mr Wilcock.
Sir David, I represent the Northern Ireland COVID-bereaved Families for Justice, and I've got 3 topics to cover with you. But before I do so, can I just make sure I understand 3 things you've said in your evidence? You've conceded, haven't you, that in early January, February, Northern Ireland was not as prepared as well as it might have been?
Yes.
And it's right, isn't it, that the NICMA process wasn't activated and the hub, which was part of that process, wasn't set up until mid-March?
Yes, the hub and the civil contingencies group weren't set up. Civil contingency group didn't start to meet regularly until the 18th of March.
And then finally, your standpoint is that Northern Ireland had every right, and this is as good a quote as I can give you, but I wrote it down as you were saying it, to put its faith in the United Kingdom's government and ability to plan and manage this crisis, given the scientific and other resources they had available to them. And that's your perspective? That's
correct.
All right. So bearing those in mind, can I start with my first topic and ask you to have a look at INQ ending 8436, please? I think it's the second document on the list I gave you. And could we have page 2 on screen, please? And I think you will see there that on the 6th of February, you sent a message to Richard Pengelly stating that, and I quote, WMC in London yesterday, we got an update on coronavirus. WMC, did that stand for the Wednesday meeting colleagues?
It's Wednesday morning colleagues.
Wednesday morning colleagues.
It's a rather quaint title for a meeting, but yes.
But that is a meeting of permanent secretaries, which is chaired by the Cabinet Secretary of the UK government and held physically at the Cabinet Office in London, although you may have attended by Zoom, one imagines, but that's where the meeting takes place.
Yes.
And just to remind ourselves in the context of your comparison between the dangers of disturbing the Cabinet Office or the CMO, the Cabinet Office has a varied role, and in terms of contingency planning, it contains a contingency secretariat, and it coordinates between the various government departments, particularly in times of crisis.
The Civil Contingency Secretariat, yes. And, for example, we had worked closely with them during the Brexit preparations.
And it's just jumping forward a bit, you were asked questions by my learned friend Ms Dobbins about communications on the 7th of March, where you said, if pressed now, my advice would be to annoy the Cabinet Office rather than the CMO, and you can hold me to that. I'm just asking, did you really regard the CMO as more important in terms of Northern Ireland's coronavirus response than the Cabinet Office?
I think, as I was explaining in my responses to Ms Dobbin, it was a slightly flippant remark, and I wouldn't want that to be seen as me making a sort of concluded judgment about the relevant significance of both organisations.
All right. Well, you've been asked questions on it, as you said.
The Cabinet Office and the Chief Medical Officer were both highly important to me, so I wouldn't want to overread that comment.
Understand. Can I take you back, please, to the message that we have on screen? You go on in that message to say that the CMO had said that the Chinese government has not, quote, got to grips with this, and it will almost certainly become a global pandemic. Do you accept, therefore, that you were aware in early February that Northern Ireland would be faced with a global pandemic of some sort in the very near future that would only peak in about 3 to 4 months and would be with us for 6 to 7 months? That's what you put in your message, isn't it?
Yes.
If we go over the page, please, I think we can see that Mr. Pengali replies, and Mr. Pengali is the Permanent Secretary of the Department of Health, isn't he?
Correct.
He replies, at one level, this was very worrying, although at peak time here it will only present only as a bad flu. Now, leaving aside the fact that sadly you were both wrong about the imminent pandemic being a flu virus, do you read the fact that Mr. Pengali put the word only in quotation marks as an indication that he at least accepted the coming pandemic was going to be very serious?
Yes. And I think the comment here is just reflecting what the advice by and large was at that stage.
Yes.
Which I was passing on, which was pandemic flu plans will be sufficient to deal with it.
Absolutely. And is that why, if we go on to 1537, I think it's the next, you ended your reply to that message with the words, I guess the problem will be if, brackets, when, it hits care homes and hospitals. Now, your evidence to us today has been, at this stage, you are regarding Northern Ireland as being in the prepare phase of your 3-stage process.
Yes.
Reading this message from early February 2020, do you agree that planning should have been underway at this stage to ensure measures were in place to protect those in care homes or hospitals before whatever pandemic hit this jurisdiction?
Yes.
Was it?
I don't want to be seen to be sort of passing the buck on this one, but that would have been a matter the Department of Health would have been clearly covering.
Okay. Well, that's one of the themes of this period, isn't it? There's a tension between the Department of Health as the lead department and the Executive Office as the sort of coordinating department if it's cross-cutting.
No, I wouldn't say there was a tension. There was a good relationship between the two departments. Like, I always enjoyed a good relationship with the Health Minister, the Chief Medical Officer, the Permanent Secretary. We understood and respected our different responsibilities and positions, and I think we worked well together.
Sort of, you know that I wasn't referring to tension in terms of bad feelings towards each other. I was meaning there was a difference of emphasis between the departments as to who was in charge of this show in February, wasn't there?
I wouldn't even say a difference of emphasis. We had different responsibilities, if you like.
All right. In your statement, and we can put it up on the screen if you want, you state that the first occasion on which the executive discussed COVID-19, and then you used the words in some depth, to be fair to you, was on the 3rd of February 2020. Do you remember saying that in your statement?
I do.
And do you agree that anything that was said in that meeting about COVID came not under a specific agenda item about COVID, but under the catch-all any other business section of the agenda? Now, if we could have
Sorry, can you just say?
Oh, I'm sorry.
The fact that it was under any other business shouldn't be taken to. People shouldn't conclude that that meant it was not a significant piece of business. That simply suggests that there wasn't. It was brought to the attention of the executive, perhaps at shorter notice.
So the fact that it was under any other business doesn't mean there wasn't a substantive discussion?
Correct.
Right. Could we have INQ ending 2903, paragraph 65 on screen, please? This is the statement that Robin Swan, the Minister of Health, has made for this inquiry. He says something different. He says, in paragraph 65, the Executive Committee held its first substantive discussion about COVID-19 on the 2nd of March 2020. And then he goes on to say, and during that discussion, the Chief Medical Officer observed, and we can all read what is said about what the Chief Medical Officer reported about what was coming. Is he right? Or are you wrong?
Well, he's making a judgment on what the reaction of other ministers and departments was at that stage. His judgment is entirely valid. I wouldn't challenge him on that. He may well be right. At that stage in early February, it's probably fair comment that people had not fully appreciated how serious this was.
Well, I want to come on to that section in a minute, but in terms of the first substantive discussion taking place on the 2nd of March, do you accept that, bearing in mind the meeting you were referring to was only a discussion under the AOB, that he's right in his recollection that the first substantive discussion took place a month later than you do?
Sorry, say that again? The first substantive discussion was on the 2nd of March?
Correct.
Yeah.
Well, you just said your recollection is that the first substantive discussion was a month earlier.
Sorry, I hadn't picked up the significance of that. I would need to look back over the handwritten notes of the meeting in early February.
Okay. And then what you were going on to deal with is the fact that in Robin Swan's statement, he says that whilst he thought there was a high level of urgency and activity by his department, health, at this stage, quote, even as the conditions and outcomes were described by the CMO that he outlined in that paragraph, he was not entirely sure that the overall impact on society was fully understood by other ministers and departments, as in his opinion, they still perceived this was a health issue that would only impact hospitals. Now, we've seen what you were saying in the messages to Mr. Pengelly shortly before about the problem coming when this hits care homes and hospitals. I want to ask you, did Mr. Swan have a point that other departments did not fully understand the overall impact of what was to come?
I think I've already conceded that
yes.
If that was his conclusion at the time, I wouldn't want to challenge it.
All right. Now, my lady, the third topic relates to a matter that Ms. Dobbins has taken Sir David through. And she knows what I'm going to ask. It's not on our pre-approved, but I think I have permission to go to it.
Give it a go, Mr. Wilcock.
Thank you very much. Could we please put on INQ ending 7435 again, please? And if we go to the bottom of page 2, you will see, Sir David, the passage that Ms. Dobbin took you through in the exchange at 1845. And just to refresh your memory, do you recall being taken through that an hour or so ago?
Yes, yeah. I do.
I want to take you through a reply to that message, which came about 45 minutes later, which is at the top of the same page, where Bernie Rooney says in the first substantive paragraph under the list, a key message that I failed to deliver would be a proportionate response. The minister, that must be Mr. Swan, did ask where people were. As David had said, we were set up. And so I had to show him our CCPB folks in the corridor. Had you told Mr. Swan that you were set up on that date?
I do not recall that at all.
As a matter of fact, if you had said that, you couldn't have been referring to anything to do with NICMA or the hub, could you?
No, we hadn't set up the hub, so I would not have been saying we had. And it would have made no sense for me to have done that.
Is there anything else you could have been referring to?
When the setting up the hub would have required a notification to the executive that we were doing that, and we hadn't done that at that stage. So I'm not entirely clear what is meant when Ms. Rooney says David had said we were set up. So I just don't know what that actually means.
I'm afraid I can't enlighten you because I didn't write the message. My lady, there are all the questions we wish to ask.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wilcock. Sir David, I've got just one question, and I'm trying to reconcile evidence you gave at the beginning of your evidence about the operation of the executive committee and the leaks and the not bringing papers until the last minute for fear they might leak. And I got the impression when you gave that evidence that the question of leaks, for example, undermined the efficacy of the way the committee worked. But then you had what Ms. Dobbin described as the rose-tinted view. How do those two different aspects of evidence, how do you reconcile them?
It's a very good question, and I think what I would say is government is difficult. It's particularly difficult at the moment. It was particularly difficult then. It's even more difficult in Northern Ireland given the nature of our constitutional arrangements. So we, the civil servants who are supporting the executive will always expect that things will not run smoothly. And, certainly I showed on many occasions, as the evidence has shown, my frustration with behaviour that fell well below best practice. But in that context, what I was saying later was that once we got past the 23rd of March and into April, I did see better collegiate working. And I just thought that needed to be said to just counter the message. And again, I think my witness statement concludes with a recognition that it is difficult working in the executive and that there nonetheless was some good cooperative working. So I don't think what I said today is contradictory to what is in my witness statement. It may sound a little odd to people, but working with the executive can be a little odd at times.
I think we can follow that. But, I mean, the leaks carried on, even in the period when you say there were better collegiate working. The leaks carried on, did they?
The leaks have been endemic
So I gather.
in executives going right back to 2000. Sadly, in this day and age, if people are determined to leak, it's very hard to stop it. You have to go to some quite extraordinary lengths, creating documents with hidden misspellings or whatever in them so that you can identify a leak. But if somebody wants to leak and cover their tracks, it's not too difficult. And I don't want to sound pessimistic in this note, but when you have the 4 or 5 party executive and things get difficult, it may be that leaks are just an occupational hazard. I wish it wasn't so, but I'm afraid that's probably my conclusion.
Sorry to sound too much like a retired judge and too legalistic, but isn't that a clear breach of the ministerial pledge?
Yes.
But no one seems to bother about that. What's the point of taking the pledge?
Well, indeed. I suspect part of the problem is that it has been extremely difficult to identify culprits And in that case, perhaps if there are no fears of sanctions, then it may well go on.
One last question. In relation to the civil service in England, Wales and I think Scotland, there is the Civil Service Code. I appreciate that you're not part of the what people call the Home Civil Service. Do you have a similar code for civil servants here?
We do, and it was revised in January, February 2020 in the light of the New Decade, New Approach agreement. It was revised by the Department of Finance at the time. It's a very similar document to the GB Code of Conduct for Civil Servants. Sorry, not Code of Conduct. Did you say Code of Conduct?
Yes.
Yeah, it's very similar.
Code. No, I said code.
Code, yes, code.
I think they call it the code. Rather
It's code, I mean, not the Code of Conduct, which is a different thing.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed, Sir David. I think that's all we need from you, so thank you for your help.
Thank you.
Right, 10 o'clock tomorrow?
Yes, my lady.
10 o'clock, please.